Staying with the topic of early neural networks, a lot of the work in the field was fueled by the plasticity of the brain and by our ability to learn, as it were, from experience. Within the formal modeling field of connectionist networks, this of course becomes learning from data, that is arriving at values for the weights that implement the desired mapping between input and output patterns. That's a radical shift in the notion of learning. And powerful means for training networks to implement a desired mapping only arose in the second wave of connectionism, as we'll see. Earlier networks, the kind that we're considering here in Unit 2, didn't learn in this fashion. There were a variety of means used to set the weight values, including selecting values by hand in order to make the damn thing work. And these allowed some interesting properties of networks to emerge, and so they stimulated this first wave of early connectionist research was not as focused on learning mechanisms, and rather not as focused on implementing desired mappings from input to output, as later networks were. They were still vaguely informed by thoughts about neuroscience, of course. It wasn't until the resurgence of network research in the 80s and 90s that the gold standard for learning algorithms, backpropagation of error, as it's called, was found. Neuroscientists, however, have been looking at changes in brain and changes in synapses intensively. And so we need to understand what the mindset was that was still informing the development of this modeling paradigm through consideration of thoughts arising from neuroscience. Now, later, when we get to implementing a desired mapping from inputs to outputs, we will have left neuroscience behind completely. The desired mapping is something imposed by the researcher. As we just saw, the numbers could be chemical readings and a decision to consume a beverage or not. They could be political opinions and a decision to vote or not. That kind of desired input-output mapping has nothing to do with neuroscience. But in neuroscience, we know that synapses are modified based on recent history, that which has gone on recently. I'll call that experience, but I'm using that in a very limited sense, meaning just that the changes we observe now are as a result of what just happened. Now, we do see this in the brain all the time. The brain is fantastically fluid. The synapses probably bear thinking about rather as a fluid than as solid or electrical connections. The brain is constantly changed based on its recent history. And one of the mechanisms for this was first mooted in 1949, long before it was ever discovered. So this was developed from theory, and it provided a way of looking at nervous systems and was quite inspired. Donald Hebb is the physiologist associated with this, and the process is called long-term potentiation. Sorry, I should have put that on the slide. There it is, long-term potentiation. That's what meant by LTP. So long-term is enduring. Potentiation means an increase in power. And so long-term potentiation refers to a long-lasting increase in the efficacy of a synapse, resulting from high-frequency stimulation to the input pathway. Now, a synapse always is between two units, two neurons in this case. Of course, we're talking brains here. One of them we can view in the context of the synapse as an input unit and the other as an output. In 1949, Donald Hebb made the following guess, and it was a inspired, wild guess. One of those things that actually move science forward sometimes. At this stage, how the brain changes based on its recent history was entirely unknown. And he suggested that when an axon of cell A, call that the upstream or input unit, excites cell B, the downstream or output unit, and repeatedly or persistently takes part in firing it, some growth process or metabolic change or something else takes place in one or both cells, another "or" in there, so that A's efficiency as one of the cells firing B is increased. This is a great hypothesis, and it's entirely woolly and vague. Donald Hebb had no idea how this happens. He thought it might be a growth process, it might be a metabolic change, it might happen to one cell, it might happen to the other cell. He had no idea of a mechanism underlying this. But he saw clearly that one way that we could non-magically consider changes induced by experience in the brain was to look at the changes in the efficacy of one neuron in stimulating another neuron. So in this case, we're talking about cell A stimulating B, and B will have inputs from 10,000 other neurons. But over time, if A persistently is involved in contributing to B's firing, then in a rich get richer scheme, A will be more likely to contribute positively to B's firing. So despite all the vagueness and the woolliness of Donald Hebb's postulate here, he was completely on the money. He didn't talk about mechanism. He talked about general principles. His hypothesis was expressed in terms that allowed us to say in 1973 that long-term potentiation, first mooted in 1949, had now been found. It was originally found by Bliss and Lomo in the hippocampus, and subsequently in all kinds of other parts of the brain, and since then the very notion of long-term potentiation has been expanded into many, many forms of collectively unsupervised learning. So here's Donald Hebb's postulate, illustrated using that idea of two neurons connected by a synapse. Unit B here, the postsynaptic or receiving cell, will have inputs from 10,000 other units. And B will repeatedly fire. And each time it fires, it does so on the basis of input from these 10,000 units, one of which is A. If over time A is a significant contributor to B's firing, that is, whenever B fires, A was involved. It was suggested by Donald Hebb, something happens here at the synapse so that A becomes even more effective. Now, this is just a model of growth of effectiveness of A in firing B. That's very, very limited. Underlying this is the view that synapses become more or less important over time, a view of plasticity. Now, the potentiation, in long-term potentiation, means we are looking at only increases in effectivity of one neuron in causing another to fire. But the idea here is that it's based only on local information. That is, there's nothing magical posited that needs external intervention. We're looking only at processes that go on around the synapse itself. And it's based only on the recent history of the synapse. This view of learning is correlational. That means that we're just exaggerating correlations between the firing of A and the firing of B. To the extent that they are strongly correlated, they will become more correlated. This is not in itself yet a learning algorithm. It's a view of how changes in the brain, based on its recent history, might arise in biological tissue. As such, this provides a way of thinking about learning as unsupervised, and it is clearly distinguished from the learning of desired outputs for a given data set that we just met in the last video. So we have a fundamental distinction here that we need to be aware of between supervised learning and unsupervised learning. In supervised learning, the modeler, the researcher, has strong views as to what constitutes proper performance, desired performance of a network. We have not only inputs, but we also have targets. And this is the domain in which backpropagation will come in and will fuel the whole second wave of connectionist research. But right now we're still looking at unsupervised learning, in which the changes that arise within a network are based only on the statistics of what goes on in the network. We'll meet several unsupervised methods as we go along, although our focus will be primarily on supervised learning in later parts of the module. So, just to drive this home, there are three big waves of connectionist research, and we're still concerned with wave one, in which vague ideas about brains were mapped onto formal models, computational models. There were no powerful training methods. That means researchers couldn't impose their view. They couldn't say what a network should or should not compute. And many, many kinds of network architectures were explored here. In the second wave, powerful training methods became available. This is where the networks became employed in modeling human behavior and learning. But notice that with the second wave, we've left neuroscience behind. There's no real plausible way to interpret what the network is doing or what the network is in terms of brains anymore. This has been missed by public awareness of this research and by most people within the field. The third wave of neural network research, which we're in the middle of at the moment, has become associated with the notion of deep learning, the employment of massive data sets, and the subsumption of connectionist research now within the broader field of machine learning and data science. As such, it's even further away from its original neurophysiological motivations and is of pretty much no relevance to understanding human cognition. But it is extremely relevant in understanding the current processes of power and social organization. The political implications of research are rarely mentioned in the context of the research. The three waves that we're given here have very different motivations and very different repercussions. Wave one is a naive and simplistic attempt to come up with formal models that bear some relevance to what we understand the basic modus operandi of a nervous system to be. And we've seen that with Warren McCullough and Walter Pitts. The second wave, which is the one we'll be concerned with mostly, took these models and applied them to various ways of understanding human behavior and learning. In doing so, of course, it leaves a lot of the neuroscience behind and has consequences for how we understand, for example, human development, what way we implement syllabuses in schools, how we distinguish between pathological and non-pathological development. And here the concerns of the researchers become far more important. The third wave we'll get onto, and we'll see that failure to recognize this history introduces very many urgent problems in contemporary society.